Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Book Trek 2021. This is a 5-month mission being helmed by myself and a group of other great booktubers in which we talk about Star Trek books. We're going to be doing it for the rest of the year. Each month, a different franchise. So August, we're doing Star Trek, the original series, my own Star Trek, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, the great Star Trek. NCC 1701, no bloody A, B, C, or D. Needless to say, once Star Trek hit it big in the movie theaters, there were hundreds of novels. So we have a lot of stuff to choose from. And my co-hosts will be bouncing all over creation. A lot of them have mentioned set TBRs. On this channel, I did not mention a set TBR because I plan on reading a lot more than I could list in a TBR. So we're going to talk about a book today. I talked about a terrible Star Trek novel yesterday. Today's isn't bad. It isn't a bad Star Trek novel, but it does raise a couple of very interesting subjects that are interesting to think about when you're reading Star Trek fiction, or really science fiction of any kind. One of the foremost of which is that science fiction, you might think this is counterintuitive, but it always reflects the technology of the day. You'd think not. You'd think it's the job of science fiction to look ahead, right? To imagine the future, to extrapolate future technologies based on present technologies, but that's the key. Most the science fiction writers who aren't genuine futurians, the genuine futurists, the ones who have a knack for sensing how things will develop and change, the ones who aren't that, and most of them aren't that, will extrapolate technology from what they have around them. And you can watch the progress of that in Star Trek. You can watch that change. I would argue that Gene Roddenberry and some of his showrunners for the original show were futurists, or at least prototypical futurists. I would argue that they were. The original Star Trek has automatic sliding doors. It has visual communication on monitors. It has a paper-free society, handheld tablets. It has handheld small devices that are communication devices, also repositories of information. It has a lot of stuff that wasn't even sketched out in the 1960s. But even the original show demonstrates what I'm talking about. Because you never know what not to think about. You never know what not to include because you don't know how technology is going to change. So when, for instance, in The Menagerie, think about the episode where Spock abducts Captain Pike in order to bring him to Talos 5. Picture that. Spock has to create duplicate tapes of Jim Kirk giving orders. He has to create a huge amount of subterfuge in order to convince the ship's computers that he has authority to remove the Enterprise from dry dock. And we see the scene where Spock is switching those tapes. The computers look exactly like computers from the late 1950s. They're huge, boxy banks of things. They wouldn't look that way. And the thing is, although Roddenberry and his crew were thinking about things like doors or TVs or money or buildings in the background, they couldn't think about everything. You don't know what not to think about. So of course the computers in the background looked just like computers in the background. They wouldn't look that way. One way or another, that crops up in Star Trek fiction a lot. You can practically date when the novel happens by what's not in the technology. And that is definitely true for what we're looking at today. This is by Brad Ferguson. It is Crisis on Centaurus. This is an early Star Trek novel that features as a guest character Joanna, the adult daughter of Dr. McCoy, who came a whisker away from being in the canon of the original Star Trek show. Dorothy Fontana and Gene Roddenberry wanted to include an episode in which we meet McCoy's old adult daughter. And I think that episode might disastrously have had Kirk want to have an affair with her, which, in my opinion, would have completely ruined the dynamic between Kirk and McCoy, which I kind of value the way it is. So I'm glad that never happened. But in the meantime, McCoy's daughter, McCoy is an unhappily divorced man, a rarity in science fiction that's on TV, certainly almost unknown in Star Trek. Adds, again, dimension to the character. And Joanna shows up again. She was very popular in fan fiction. And she's cropped up in authorized Star Trek a couple of times. In this case, on the planet Centaurus, in the Alpha Centauri system, which is only a handful of light years away from Earth, so it was early to be colonized. There are beautiful colonial cities there of human settlements. It's a lovely M-class planet, and at the beginning of this novel, two things happen at the start of the novel. One is that a Tellarite has an argument with an automated credit card machine and breaks it in order to pry his credit card back out of the machine, and he gets a round of applause from the crowd. And there are brand signs for Coca-Cola and whatnot. You're watching this. I remember reading this thing this came out in 1986. And I remember reading this at the time thinking, oh, come on, surely the future is more advanced than this, right? Surely you wouldn't need to stick your card into a machine. Of course, now we would look at that and think everything about this is antiquated, right? You have kiosks and businesses and firms that can scan your card in your pocket from across a lobby so that you never even need to touch it. You never even need to remove it. And the Coca-Cola still being around on another planet in the 23rd century is the same thing as if people nowadays were routinely talking about balsam-specific one-drop pellets. It wouldn't happen. It wouldn't happen. Nothing like that would happen. And that, again, is a perfect example of a writer, in this case Brad Ferguson, just not thinking about what he shouldn't think about. So, the key, one of the fun exercises of science fiction is to imagine your world with no givens. Look at the world around you and imagine no givens, so that you can imagine a future in which any of those givens could be gone or could change. It's a mark of less talented science fiction writers that they have huge blind spots for that sort of thing. And there are huge blind spots throughout here. But shortly after that, Tellarite rescues his card from a kiosk. A terrorist sets off an antimatter bomb. There's a box in his lap, and the contents of the box are contained in a magnetic field, and the contents are a small amount of antimatter. And when the antimatter makes contact with the matter of the box, there's a huge detonation, 1 million people killed. And we learn in the course of this novel that McCoy spent a lot of time on Centaurus, and that his daughter Joanna lives there. And we also learn that Kirk owns property there, that he bought, because we're told in this book that Starfleet captains are ridiculously overpaid. This does not jive with Kirk saying in the original show that they don't get paid at all. With Kirk saying in Star Trek The Voyage Home that they don't have money anymore. All that sort of stuff. The whole subject of money and economy in the Federation in the 23rd century is murky at best in these books. But here, Brad Ferguson comes down squarely on the side of Starfleet personnel, and especially captains, being paid very well to risk their lives and the lives of their crew to expand the knowledge of the human race and defend the planet against invasion. Makes a kind of sense. Kirk uses some of that money to buy property on Centaurus, and has a log cabin there. We're told that he sends a lot of the rest of his money to his one surviving blood relative, his nephew, Peter, who makes an appearance in Star Trek fan-produced videos that some of you may know about. Some of you may know how Peter is characterized as an adult man in those shows. But here, in the original series, we only see him as a boy who's deathly ill. His parents die, but he lives. And he's Kirk's blood relative, so we learn that Kirk sends money to him. But that is one of the things that starts this book, is that there's an antimatter explosion on Centaurus. And for a long time, we are told that McCoy's daughter Joanna lives there. We're told all about McCoy's deep history with Centaurus, specifically because Brad Ferguson is delaying our curiosity about whether or not she's okay, whether or not she was hurt in this explosion. We know that the two are connected, and that's skillfully done. The other thing that starts off this novel is that the Enterprise has massive technical problems. The most noticeable one at the beginning of the book is that the artificial gravity quits completely. So people are floating around the corridors in 0G. And so is bathwater, and so are utensils and whatnot. Everything's floating around on the ship. That's an emergency. That's a real emergency, and there are plenty of other things that are going wrong. The ship's technology seems to go haywire. It's at this point early in the novel that we're introduced to a second in command in engineering under Scotty, and it's another Scotsman who's just like Scotty, has the same accent, the same attitude, the same miracle worker status. Really confusing. I'd love to talk to Brad Ferguson if he's still alive and find out what he was thinking. Why introduce a clone of a character? Even the characters on board the Enterprise, even Kirk himself, routinely think of the two as the twins. Well, why do that? Why would you do that? I don't get it. I've read this book a couple of times, and I don't get it. I read it again for Book Trek 2021. I still don't understand that at all. Not at all. The Enterprise, in the midst of this crisis, when they're all floating around, gets a priority message from Starfleet. One of the things I'm noticing as I reread a lot of these original Star Trek novels for Book Trek 2021 is how many of them start with Jim Kirk getting an encoded, encrypted, highest possible priority message from Starfleet. Kind of a MacGuffin, kind of a Deus Ex Machina there, that I when you read these things one a month for years, you don't quite notice it as when you're reading one a day. Then you notice the things, the gimmicks that crop up over and over again, and that one starts off so many of these books. But they get a call from Starfleet alerting them to the explosion on Centaurus and ordering them to go there and offer all possible assistance. And they manage to do it. By this point, they've got a little bit of the artificial gravity back. They're starting to get some of the ship systems back, so they manage to limp along to Centaurus, and Kirk has to deliver the news to McCoy. This has been a massive explosion. We don't know how many people are dead, and we don't know if Joanna is alive. It's very well done. It takes place in the midst of a whole bunch of flashbacks, one of which is a first meeting between Kirk and McCoy. There are now a number of first meetings between Kirk and McCoy that are floating around in all the different books, and of course in the famous J.J. Abrams movie where they meet for the first time, where the nickname Bones comes from, all that sort of stuff. There are many, many different versions of that. Nothing that is canonical unless you're going to call the J.J. Abrams Kelvin timeline canonical. I don't, so if you do, fine, but that's not our universe. That's not our reality of Star Trek. Even in the Kelvin timeline, the Roddenberry timeline exists as a separate thing. So I'm not saying that it's completely canon. But one way or another, this book gives us that. It gives us a history of Kirk and McCoy. That is well done. And the ship eventually gets to Centaurus, where they have to deal not only with sorting out the damage of this explosion, but of course also the terrorist groups that are involved in having set it off in the first place. And all of that is well deployed. This is a very entertaining novel. It has no major gaffes except for a couple. I don't understand why Scotty has a clone. I don't get that at all. When you have an infinite variety to choose from to make a secondary character, why you would do that, I have no idea. Also, when the Enterprise gets to Centaurus, they beam down parties to help with organizing and rescuing and with dealing with the terrorists. And that would never in a million years happen. Never in a million years. If you had a starship that was having ship-wide technical difficulties, the very last piece of technology you would trust would be the transporters. I don't think you'd trust the shuttlecrafts either. I don't see... The first time that I read this book, back in 1986, I thought, okay, well, but the first thing that Kirk would do, if Starfleet sent that priority message, would be to relay that he's having massive life-threatening problems on his own ship, and that he's not available. That's totally legitimate. A captain doesn't have to hurry off no matter what. What if his warp nacelles was exploding? He wouldn't go then. His answer should have been, I am not available. We are in the middle of a gigantic crisis of our own. The ship could, at one point early in the novel, before they get that message and head off to Centaurus, Spock tells Kirk that the computers can't even be relied upon to keep the antimatter mix safe on their own ship. They could explode. The biggest explosion since the last star in these suns exploded. There's no way that the Enterprise in the opening chapters of this book is fit for duty. But they charge off anyway. And there's a reunion with McCoy and Joanna, and there are some wonderful moments between the various members of the crew that are sent on their various missions on the ship. And there's also a wonderful turn of events because Scotty is completely absorbed in trying to save the ship and trying to get the ship's mechanical problems back online. Uhura takes temporary command of the Enterprise. That was tremendously refreshing, and it's done perfectly. No pandering, no comic, no nothing like. It's done perfectly. Again, I got the impression, as I mentioned with Diane Carey the other day, I get the impression that Brad Ferguson watched a lot of Star Trek. And one of the main impressions I got that from in reading this book is the way he depicts the way Kirk commands his crew. That is very hard to do. Most writers don't get it right. Most of them don't get it right. Kirk has unquestioned authority among his crew. You cannot, if he's in a dark mood, if he's in a martinet mood, you don't cross him. Absolutely not. He has absolute authority on his crew, a harder discipline, I would argue, than any starship captain that we see. But more than any starship captain, other than maybe Catherine Janeway, he rules by compassion. His crew knows that he cares about them, and that he would sacrifice his life for any one of them. They know that about him. He's not just a bloodless chief executive, a boardroom ruler, like maybe another Enterprise captain I could name. I'll be plenty of time for that next month. Oh, we're going to have such arguments next month. And maybe I'll come around. But he isn't that. Instead, he rules by compassion, and Ferguson captures that perfectly. Just perfectly here. That he doesn't brook over-familiarity. He doesn't brook slang or insubordination. He doesn't brook slacking off, but he cares. And he very much encourages everybody on the ship to pipe up. You have something to say, you have a question, an argument, a concern to raise, go right ahead. Don't stand on ceremony. I'm not going to be hiding in my ready room. Instead, I'm right here, pipe right up. I love that. Absolutely love that. That is absolutely true to the show. And it doesn't happen in every Star Trek novel. I wish it did, but it doesn't. Star Trek novels are far more likely to get the bickering between McCoy and Spock correct than they are to get Kirk, the center of the show, correct. Crisis on Centaurus does that perfectly right to the end. There's a twist at the end that involves Kirk, and it's handled perfectly, just perfectly. So I do recommend this as a Star Trek novel. I don't know how much I'm going to be ranking these things, how many triples each book gets, but this one was definitely, there weren't many clunky moments to revisit in this thing. It was mostly enjoyable. The main thing that I was thinking of while I was reading it is the point that I mentioned, which is that you don't know, when you're writing science fiction, you don't know, can I get the cover back there? You don't know what you don't know. You don't know what not to think about. This book was written in the late 1980s. Great number of you who are watching this video were not born in the late 1980s, but that was before the internet. For 99.9% of everybody on Earth, that was before the internet. It was in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, that people started thinking, hey, these computer things, maybe I should get one of my own. Maybe I should start to understand the information superhighway, the World Wide Web. Maybe I should start to understand what a website is, what a link is, what a URL is. Maybe I should start to do that. It was only in the mid-late 90s that most people in the general non-tech public started to think that way. In 1986, no one did. No one had a computer. No one had the internet. There was no internet. There was no anything like that. There was no anything like that. 5,000 more satellites are in orbit now than were in orbit of this planet in 1986. And all that entails, all that made possible. But if you lived through Sputnik, and you had the heart and soul of a genuine science fiction writer, you could probably look up at the sky at the handful of satellites that were up there and make some deductions, and you might be right. And you're looking at this thing, when Brad Ferguson describes the state-of-the-art space dock, the state-of-the-art spaceport on Centaurus, when Brad Ferguson describes the nature of the technology on board the ailing Enterprise, when he describes a technological hub later in the book, there's no hint. I'm not saying there's no internet. I'm not expecting this guy to be the amazing Kreskin, but there's no hint of anything like that. There's no hint of it whatsoever. There's no even vague idea about an interconnected web of omniscient technology. Nothing like that at all. It doesn't even occur to the author to speculate on it. And I'm not really using that as a castigation. That happens all throughout early Star Trek. I remember reading one early Star Trek novel. I think it was Trek to Mad World. Or The Starless World, something like that. In one very early Star Trek novel, pre-lawyer Star Trek novels. I don't think I'll be reading it for book Trek. I remember there was one little detail in one of those books where McCoy is in his private quarters. He calls up the newspaper of the day and prints out just a couple of sections of it, the sections that he wants to read. And I remember back in the early 1980s, or whenever it was that book came out, reading that and thinking, wouldn't that be incredible? To be able to tailor the daily newspaper for the parts you want to read, as opposed to getting the whole thing and slogging through the whole thing and having parts of it drop off all over the place. That struck me as amazing to think about. And it was only because neither the author nor I could imagine a day when that would be not only possible, but easy. I can do it on this device. I can do it on the device that I'm filming on. I can do it on a phone in my pocket. Crazy. And none of us ever thought that. Not at all. No way. Never thought about anything like an internet. And I'm not saying that this author fails on that regard, but you can definitely tell when you read this book and books like it when it was written. Roughly when it was written. You certainly know. In Star Trek books, if you can't pin down the year, you certainly know when they were written before and after the internet. The greatest technological change, I would argue, in human history, and certainly, hands down, the greatest technological change in our lifetime. A thing that I've read scarcely any. I've read a lot of great writing on the internet and on the effects it has on society, but I've read scarcely anything of what it deserves. I've read nothing close to the where's the Leo Tolstoy of the internet? Where's the Edward Gibbon? There hasn't been one. It's still too young, but it is seismic, absolutely seismic, and that is nothing else. That is the technological dividing line that runs through a lot of these early Star Trek books, where once the internet started happening, once devices started becoming small and tiny and ubiquitous, then the future started changing, right? The data pads that characters hold up in Star Trek The Next Generation and all the iterations forward, they don't really happen in the original show. There are those slates that Kirk writes on. He's clearly not using paper. He's clearly not using pen. But he's not touching anything either. He's using a stylus. It's an ancestor of that. And I don't think we even have that if Roddenberry and his people weren't genuinely talented at looking at the future. Not so much here, and I imagine that's going to crop up in a lot of books that we see in August. The writer is just taking what they have around them, and they're changing some things, but not changing others. The classic example that I always come up with here, it has nothing to do with Star Trek. It's Thrice Upon a Time, a novel by James Hogan, who was a scientist. And Thrice Upon a Time takes place a little bit in the future from the day when I think it came out in the 1980s, the early 1980s. It's supposed to take place a little bit in the future. There are ground skimming hover cars, but there's no internet. Hogan was thinking about some things, but not about everything. He wasn't thinking about he wasn't imagining the internet. I would argue that as good a scientist as he is, Star Trek, the original series, actually came closer to imagining the internet than he did, with the Enterprise's main computer banks, which don't just access material on board the Enterprise. They can also range outward from there, and they're instantaneous, and they have a voice modulation interaction. They have a user interface, if you would. No term like that existed at the time, but I think they do a real good job. That does a real good job of looking ahead, maybe a little bit anticipating the omniscience of the technology all around us. This book does not, but it's still a very good original series episode. A very good, enjoyable story. So it gets a recommend for today. We'll see what tomorrow does. We couldn't get through a whole video. Maybe someday. But in the meantime, this is actually a good Star Trek book. We'll see if tomorrow we strike gold again. I had not read this thing in years. I am, for Book Trek 2021, going to try and do that. I'm going to try and deal with books that I'm not completely familiar with. So I won't be dealing with any of the books that I talked about in my starter kit. And I won't be dealing with a lot of others, too, that I didn't mention in that starter kit, but that I love a lot. I'm going to try to avoid those, instead look again with fresh eyes at a lot of these books that I haven't picked up in a long time. So who knows what tomorrow's will be. I'll pick it this afternoon. And I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.